Everyone.
Thanks, Melanie. And we'll just give it another minute while everyone probably ends their previous meeting and then jumps on to this one or gathers their lunch, depending on where they are in the country. I know folks are probably feeling shy, but if they want to say hello in the chat and share, what they're interested in learning about, what organization they're from, or where in the country they're coming in from, it's always interesting for us to just to know what you are interested in learning so then we can make sure we hit on some of those points. All right, well, we are at the top of the hour, so why don't we jump in? So thanks everyone for joining. Really, really are excited about this panel as you maybe heard if you were on a little bit earlier, us saying it's a bit of the battle of the consultants. So we're kind of excited to have so much expertise here on the line with us. And this is one of several panel discussions that WIM has been hosting this past year. Just an opportunity for us to get, some of our partners to share their expertise and to be able to kind of have learning opportunities for everyone who's part of the WIM network. So really excited about that. And thank you to our panelists for joining. As I'm sure everyone's aware of, we are talking about technical reports, uh, NI 43101, SK 1300s, maintaining independence, all of that exciting stuff. And so we've got our experts on the line to answer questions associated to that. I'm Katherine Arblaster. I'm from UEC, Uranium Energy Corp, a uranium mining company out of the US, and I'm one of the WIM volunteers who very excitedly gets to help host these panels every couple months. So just a few housekeeping items before we dive in and start the conversation. So one is you probably are all aware we are recording. That is just really for us to be able to post this up on the WIM website. So for anyone who wanted to join but wasn't able to, they can go back to this and have a listen. We'll also be sharing a feedback survey for anyone interested in providing feedback or also suggesting any future panel topics that they want to hear. We certainly are open to those suggestions, so please do respond and let us know any feedback you have. And then also, we want to hear from you. So please feel free, type in the chat, let us know what's on your mind. If you have certain things you want to hear about, let us know. There is also the Q&A function. So if you do have a very specific question that you would like to get answered, feel free to put it in that. And I will say that depending on how chatty people are feeling in the chat, sometimes we have to scroll back up to find all the questions that you might have put. So if you put it in the Q&A, we will make sure that it does get answered versus in the chat, we may lose it. So we're excited to have everyone here. Instead of me trying to go around and do justice to everyone's experience, I am instead going to kick us off and dive into the questions. And then as you kind of answer your first question, please also, tell us about yourself, a bit of your experience, and kind of what led you here to be able to be talking about the exciting topic of technical reports. So I'll kick off with Maegan. And so NI 43101, SK 1300, what are these? Give us a bit of an overview of kind of what we're talking about today and why they're important.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name is Maegan Ayotte. I am a principal mining engineer at WSP. I also lead a group of mining engineers. So I come from a background of working in operations. I sit in Thunder Bay. I grew up in Sudbury. I'm a mining engineer. My background is hard rock mining in Northern Ontario. I've gone back and forth between consulting and operations. I've done work in mineral reserves, in operations, and in consulting. So kind of seen a little bit of everything from the standpoint of the practitioner, which kind of led me to joining in on this panel discussion. In terms of the regulations and standards and all those finer details, we have some amazing panelists here that will have a lot more in-depth experience to answer on some of those pieces. But I'm going to give an overview of the sort of intent of these reports and why they're so important in the mining industry. So just in a very broad general sense, what are they? They are a report or reports that are intended to summarize information on mineral deposits for investors and the public. And because of that reason, there's regulations and standards that have been established between the regulators and the industry on what is disclosed in an accurate way, and it keeps companies accountable. So if we want to talk specifically about National Instrument 43-101, this applies to companies that are listed in the Canadian exchanges, whereas SK 1300 applies to companies registered with the US Securities and Exchange Commission. So those are sort of very broadly what kind of defines which reporting standard you would seek. And these standards apply for reporting for both public and private companies. It encompasses a variety of different disclosure types. So we can kind of highlight some of those. Particularly, there's things like initial public offerings, periodic disclosures, which would be annual reports, for example, that bigger mining companies put out to the public. There's also continuous disclosures where there's a material change on a project. So this is what, on a consulting side, I deal with a lot. For example, PEAs, PFSs, and feasibility studies. So when companies are trying to establish a new mineral resource, to expand on that mineral resource, to gain investors, and to push their mineral project through to execution stage. Those are all important steps along the way. And the way that that information is reported is absolutely 100% standardized and regulated. And a big piece of this is that the reporting rules aim to prevent companies from sharing inaccurate or misleading information about their mineral asset to the public and the investors. And that's why this is overseen by the different regulators. Major steps involved. Everything has to be signed off by a professional, qualified person who takes responsibility for the information. And we'll touch on this more as we go through the chat. It needs to be clear, it needs to be balanced, and it can't be misleading, and transparency is very, very important here. It needs to be understandable to a reasonably informed investor. Not everybody reading these technical reports has gone through and gotten a degree in geology or geological engineering or mining engineering. So that's also a very important thing to consider here. And it needs to be consistent in its use of standardized terms and definitions. For example, CIM standards, SME standards, those are all extremely important. It needs to be based on reasonable assumptions, which are clearly explained, and it needs to be unbiased and identify potential risks and uncertainties. So these are all really, really important pieces that go into these technical reports, so that they all share the same standards, they follow the same format, they have the same chapter definitions. People can open these reports and look at these different mineral assets and kind of make informed decisions based on whatever they may be, whether they're a junior, they're an investor, they're a student wanting to educate themselves on a mining method or mining in certain areas of the country. They're information for everybody, and it's standardized for a very important reason. So that kind of just summarizes. I don't want to go into details on all of these because other people will during our panel discussion, but yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell.
That's great, Megan. And that's a great overview. And it's helpful because that kind of tells us what the commonalities between the two standards are. But now let's dive a little bit deeper and talk about what the differences are. So Sally and Nikki, can you tell us a little bit about what is the difference between the SK 1300, the US standard, and the Canadian standard being the NI 43101?
I'm going to start this, and I'm actually going to start more by going into the similarities and why
Okay.
they exist. So my name is Sally Gillies, and my background is I've got about 20 years experience in exploration geology, and I worked in all levels deposit, polymetallic deposits, from grassroots through to brownfields exploration. But the reason I'm on this panel is because I also spent 12 years at the TSX Venture Exchange, where I have reviewed literally thousands of technical reports for compliance of 43101, and I also helped list several hundred companies. And today I work at Ausenco as their technical director of geology and compliance, and I help Ausenco ensure that all the reports that go out to their clients are compliant with 43101 or the various code in their jurisdictions that they're writing the report for. So as Maegan alluded to, I think it's very important to understand there's a lot of similarities between all these various disclosure regimes. I mean, we have 43101 in Canada, we've got SK 1300 in the US, we've got JORC in Australia. Why is that? It's basically because as far back as the 1970s, the mining industry was beginning to recognize that there was a problem. It's like, you know, when somebody reports a resource or reserve in one location, it could be completely different to another location. So out of that, eventually by the mid-1990s, a committee was formed called the Committee for Mineral Reserves International Reporting Standards. And out of that, they created several definitions, which we're very familiar with today, including competent persons, except we call them qualified persons in North America, the inferred, measured, and indicated resources, the proven and probable reserves, and also introduced us to modifying factors. So these are several variables that everybody should be thinking about when they are putting together a reserve and trying to work out if it's actually economics applicable to the deposit. And as a result of that, they created a template. And this template underlies all the countries that have signed on to this. And, so it's like, even though they've got this template in North America, it's actually been converted into securities law in the US and Canada, and they're very similar. And Nikki will probably go into more details about that in a second. And in other countries like Europe or Australia, it's a code which the securities regulators say that companies should use to disclose the information. So there's a lot more enforcement in Canada and the US because it's securities law and the companies are legally obliged to abide by it. Whereas in Australia and Europe and other places like South America and South Africa, etc., there is obviously a strong emphasis to use it. The exchanges are requiring it, but it's not regulated quite as heavily as it is in Canada. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nikki to explain precisely what are the differences between NI 43101 and SK 1300.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Nikki Agyei. I work for Wood Canada Limited, based out of Oakville. I've been with the company for quite some time. I'm a mining engineering graduate with a postgraduate degree in geostatistics and mine planning. And I spent the early part of my career estimating resources and acting as a QP in that area. More recently, in the last, 5 to 8 years, I've been working on the compliance side, putting together, compiling NI 43101 technical reports, also SK 1300 reports. I've also been co-presenters with Greg Gosson and Stella Searson at a couple of mining conferences. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Well, there's a lot of content in these two rules. They're almost the same. SK 1300 is heavily based on 43101. There's several SK 1300 instructions describing the content requirements for given sections that are direct copies from 43101. So as much as the two are similar, there are some key differences. And to answer this question thoroughly, we would need a lot more time than the limited amount of time that we have today. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of fundamental differences that is probably relevant to many of you on the call today. Start with the qualified person, definition of a qualified person. It is a defined term under 43101, and it specifies that an individual must hold a university degree in either geoscience or engineering related to mineral mining or exploration. So someone has an accounting degree, who's spent years producing capital cost estimates for mining studies, cannot be a QP in Canada. A chemist who's had several years of experience working in a mineral assay laboratory can't be a QP. An environmental scientist who has experience in permitting also cannot be a QP. There's another big requirement for being able to act as a QP, and that's the QP must have at least 5 years of relevant experience in exploration, mine development, or operations that is relevant to their degree. So what we're finding now is that the Canadian regulators consider that these 5 years start from when they are professionally registered. So when you become a professionally registered engineer or a geologist, that is when your 5 years starts. So this means that anyone who has a lot of experience in the mining industry in Canada or outside of Canada that have not been registered in Canada or by one of the accepted foreign associations cannot act as a QP until they have had the additional 5 years of so-called professional experience. SK 1300 is a bit different. It's to a defined term in the rule that requires a professional to have at least 5 years of relevant experience in the mineralization or deposit that's being looked at. They must also be a member in good standing with a recognized professional association. So there's no specific organization that is listed, as is in the companion policy of 43101. And there's no, they do, however, have to specify, the organization has to specify what constitutes professional association. For example, they must require or encourage continuing education, and they must provide a list of members in good standing. So it does not prescribe that a QP, a qualified person, must be a professional geologist or an engineer. So that environmental scientist, that accountant, that chemist, they could, if they are recognized by a professional organization, they could act as a QP. So related to QPs is the QP certificates and consents. And for those QPs among us, we're all too familiar with the requirements for filing qualified person certificates and qualified person consents on CDAR Plus when a company files a technical report. So the requirements for a QP certificate are clearly stated in the rule, and there's a template for a QP consent in the companion policy. In SK 1300, when an issuer files a technical report summary on EDGAR, the only thing that's required is consent. There is no requirement for a QP certificate. And there's another list, another twist. And in the US, QPs don't have to actually be named if they're employed by what SK 1300 call a third-party firm, which is a firm comprising of mining experts. So in this case, a consent from the firm is sufficient when filing a technical report summary. However, if there's more than one firm involved in the preparation of the technical report summary, then the report needs to specify who is responsible for what section, as would be done in a QP certificate when filing a technical report on CDAR Plus. The introduction of the third-party firm in SK 1300 was developed for a couple of reasons. One being its flexibility, as you know, this is QPs tend to move around. They don't tend to stay with a company for 100 years. So when a mining company is looking for consents in the future or after, a couple years down the road, they need consents from the QP who prepared the reports. It's a little bit easier if it's a third-party firm, because that third-party firm can then do their own due diligence internally and not have to seek that original QP. Another reason for introducing the concept of the third-party firm is to limit the liability exposure to individual QPs. So there's this individual liability exposure in the US more, it's well known to be more so in the US than it is in Canada. and it allows the firm to take responsibility and liability rather than the individual QP, while still preparing a credible report. So as the US is a country of, suing people more regularly than in Canada, it was a real concern that good qualified individuals may not want to take the risk and act as a QP. So naming the third party firm, rather, an individual or individuals was thought to help out this concern. SK 1300 also allows QPs to rely on a company for certain types of content, such as legal, tax, environmental, marketing, social type, very specific types of information. And if by being able to rely on the company, it removes the liability of the QPs and it places the liability on the registrant or the company for that information. NI 43-101, the QP is allowed to rely on experts and they can disclaim responsibility for that type of information that I just listed. However, in the US, no disclaimers are allowed. So that's a few. I think I've probably taken up enough time. I could go on and on. There's a lot of differences.
Nuanced differences.
I think I'll hold it there. I think probably many of us on the line are QPs and are interested in what the differences are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nikki. And there is a question in the chat, and I think you did touch on it a little bit, but maybe just to give a definitive answer, maybe it's not that clear cut. But I believe Melanie is asking about SK 1300s because it's a little bit less defined what the relevant experience or how relevant experience is determined and how strict is it. So she's giving the example of if you have open pit experience, is that relevant everywhere, or is it open pit in particular jurisdictions or particular commodities? Like, how would they maybe think about that?
I think with the mining type is important. The deposit type is also important. Okay. For a geologist working in a certain mining type, deposit type is more important. If most of your experience is in open pit mining, then you're a qualified person in open pit mining as opposed to signing off on an underground design.
Gotcha. Okay, that's a very helpful clarification. Okay, thank you for that overview. And I think it's clear these reports play an important role in the market. And I'm curious, and we'll get a few different perspectives, but these are important, I think, to different parts of the market as well. And I think they're viewed differently. And so, Daniel, I'd love to ask you your perspectives on how important these reports are, but particularly kind of contrasting the view of maybe one of the larger mining companies versus kind of the junior mining company perspective as well.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. I'll introduce myself quickly. I'm Daniel Gagnon. I'm based in Montreal. I'm mining engineer background. I'm senior VP at DRA North America. So I'm responsible for mining geology group for North America, also general manager of the Montreal office. Over 25 years of experience. Been involved in technical reports probably for the last 15 years at least on geology and mining. So I've seen a lot, mostly with juniors. So I've seen their perspective. So I know how these reports are important to the mining companies. Well, first thing, they're mandatory. For majors and juniors, it's the first time they issue or talk about a resource estimate, or if they do PEA or PFS or an FS. For the majors, after that, if there's not 100% change, doubling the resource, doubling the reserve, it's not mandatory to report those. For juniors, well, usually it's their bread and butter. It's, they've got one deposit, they've got a mineral resource estimate, then they'll do a PEA, and they use these technical reports to raise money, to aware on the markets, investors that they're doing something. So for them, it's very, very important. Even juniors, they'll go from one step to the other in support. Sometimes they'll do FS updates, which are not necessarily required, but they want to keep that, it's their baby. For majors, like I said, some will do technical reports, some won't, unless there's something, they've announced this resource estimate, they're not doubling it, but they found a high, big grade zone. And if they announce to the public it's a material change, basically material change, it will affect their share price. We're not talking a few percentage, 10, 15, 20% is a big change. And maybe Sally and I saw Greg Gosson is on the line if they want to comment on that, but material change will affect the share price. So for a junior, obviously, for a major, it has to be something big. A Barrick multi-billion-dollar company, a small change in the resource, and it's not going to change. For a junior that's got a small market cap, it's the only thing they have, it will have an effect. So those reports are important.
Absolutely. Thank you. And it's a good segue. Maybe Sally, I'll go to you from the exchange and the investor standpoint as well. And in my role, I do quite a bit of IR, and it's interesting how important it is to have technical reports out defining the resource, to have investors actually put any weight behind, what that deposit might hold. So that's kind of been the observation I've made in my role, and interested, Sally, in your perspective on both the exchange, given your previous experience at TSX, and then also from the investor standpoint.
Well, I guess it's a bit challenging really to define the investor, isn't it? I mean, 43-101 F1 just says, these reports are aimed at the investing public and their advisors. And when you think about it, these reports are used for a lot more, as both Maegan and Daniel have alluded to. So what is an investor? Is it somebody like you and me, an individual who's investing, or is it an institutional investor, like a big pension fund? It could be mining journalists just looking to make a bit of income there by sensationalizing the results of a company, which I'm sure Daniel will agree it can be a problem for the company, because the company would want to talk about that, but they can't. It's also very much a promotional tool for companies. It's not just about, it's required by the regulations. These companies want these reports because this is how they're going to raise money. If they can have a report out there that says we've got good results on this property, then maybe we can go out and raise money. But it's also a marketing tool, because they're always trying to either sell their project or be bought. Especially, I mean, this is an exit strategy for a lot of companies. So it's, like an investment decision by an individual, it can almost be the same as by the company. What is the exit strategy from this project? So, it's just hard to define the investor, and it makes it a challenging thing when the QPs are writing these reports, because it's like you're thinking, okay, I'm just aiming this at Joe Blow, who's just going to buy some shares in the company. But the reality is these reports are used by a lot of different people for a lot of different investment reasons. With respect to the exchange, I don't know how many on the call know this, but all our stock exchanges, well, at least the TSX stock exchanges, are actually a public company. They're held by the TMX group. And I think a lot of people confuse the exchange with regulators, and I don't think the exchange likes to think of themselves as regulators. But they come across that way because all the exchanges, the Canadian Stock Exchange, the TSX Venture Exchange, the TSX, they all have recognition orders with the various provincial bodies. So like the TSX Venture and has it with the BCSC, the Canadian Stock Exchange, the TSX have the recognition orders with the Ontario Securities Commission. And part of those recognition orders says we're going to hold our issuers accountable. And then, of course, into their policies, as opposed to the regulations themselves. So all the exchanges have policies. In those policies, pretty much when it comes to a mining property, if there's a trigger for a report, it says it must be compliant with 43-101. And then that makes it an obligation then to check those reports to make sure they comply with 43-101. And the big thing here to remember is you can sometimes talk to the regulators if you've got an issue with your report, and they may be able to waive a part of 43-101. They're not going to do it lightly because they don't want to set a precedent in any way, shape, or form, but an exchange can't. So often when a report is going to be reviewed by the stock exchange, it's going to be reviewed thoroughly, and it can actually hold up transactions because we can't waive anything in 43-101 that isn't compliant. So these issues need to be addressed. And then there's a second purpose when the reason that the exchanges have requested these reports is generally to support a transaction. Those transactions are mostly going to be a listing or an acquisition. And those listings can take the form of you actually directly list with the exchange, or you're doing initial prospectus offering, or you're doing a reverse takeover, which is where there's a company that's basically a shell on the exchange, gets taken out by a company with a property and an asset and everything. So it's called a reverse takeover. And in those reports, not only do they have to comply with 43-101, the exchange will be looking at them to make sure that these properties meet, or these companies are coming in with an asset that meets our listing requirements. So that in that, they're looking to see, okay, what will be the ownership of the property? So they look to Section 4, the property location and description. They will be looking to see what work has been done on the property, to make sure there's been a minimum amount of work done on the property, either by the company itself or by the company that's doing owns the property, depending on the transaction type. So for there, they'll be looking in sections 9 or 10, there was exploration and drilling done. And they'll also sometimes, if it's a more advanced stage property, they'll be looking at whether it's got resources and reserves. And then they'll be looking at the recommended work program, because when a company lists, it has to be able to detail a budget saying, we need a certain amount of money to be able to stay alive for the first year or two. This is our budget. And part of that budget includes what is the recommended work program. And then similarly, on a slightly lower level is the acquisitions. And again, the exchanges will be looking at these reports to make sure that the company will have the rights to the asset when they make the acquisition. And also, what is their budget? Because in that state, usually they've got to have enough money to keep the property going for about 6 months or so. So that's what the exchanges are looking at for the reports. And it's very different to what the regulators may be looking at the reports for. And I just wanted to make that distinction clear to our audience.
Yeah, I think it's a great distinction, because I know personally I conflate them as kind of the same idea, right? But it is very different. And maybe, Nikki, if you want to speak to the regulators' perspective, because I think Sally just did a great job of kind of differentiating those two as well for us. Oh, you're muted.
I like Zoom. It has big messages saying you're on mute. No one can hear you. All right, thanks a lot, Sally. The government securities regulators, they provide oversight, as Sally said, to the stock exchanges, and they rely on professional associations to be regulators of themselves. They're a regulatory group for professional and ethical practices to which the mining companies and the mining individuals must follow. The regulators enforce securities laws, including rulemaking authorities such as the 43-101 and I-43-101. The rules are put in place. These rules are put in place to maintain a credible capital market and provide investors with the confidence they need to rely on information provided by the company. And technical reports and technical report summaries represent such information. So it's important that there's regulators in place to make sure the rules are being followed. The technical reports facilitates capital raising, so investors have a document to rely on when they're making investment decisions. And this helps maintain a healthy mining industry. And in Canada, mining has been seen as a credible capital market, and 43-101 has helped maintain and enhance that title. In the US, the mining market is a lower contributor to the capital markets, but at a very high risk to the capital markets, because there's a lot of speculation and forward-looking information on which the mining assessments are based. In Canada, the resource industry makes up a large portion of the capital markets. It's important to the economy, so there has to be specific rules around the mining industry in order to manage the risk. More recently, the mining industry is getting more attention as it plays a key role in providing critical minerals to the manufacturing industries. So just to move away from that a little bit, there's a common misunderstanding that if a technical report is filed on CDAR Plus, then it's been reviewed by a regulator and is therefore compliant. And for the majority of the situations, this isn't the case. There is a large amount of information that are being disclosed by mining companies, and regulators will review some key documents like prospectuses, but we can't rely on the fact that the regulators have reviewed all the reports that are being filed on CDAR Plus. In the US, the SEC mining staff are mandated actually to review the disclosure of mining companies every 3 years. However, the level of review will be typically based on the quality of the work that's been filed, and the reviews could be quite limited. The SEC tend to send letters to the reviewed company outlining any non-compliance to be addressed. And these letters are filed on EDGAR. So it allows companies to obtain a better understanding of compliance as they can see what issues are being raised and how they've been responded to. In Canada, the regulators may also use the reviews of the technical reports that they look at and other disclosures to put out staff notices, clarifying common misinterpretations or misrepresentations of the rule which they've been seeing during their reviews. These clarifications are a really good lessons learned tool that everyone, QPs and companies, should refer to ensure that they're not making the same mistakes as others. The Canadian regulators are also really active in educating the industry. That's part of another thing that job that they do, and they facilitate workshops and presentations at conferences. So if you have the opportunity to attend any of these sessions, it's well worth it and very educating. Thanks.
Thanks, Nikki. And maybe a follow-up question on one of the things you mentioned, and then also some questions in the chat. So one being, you mentioned in Canada, it's not, a lot of us operate under the assumption that a regulator has reviewed the technical report before it's been released. But what would happen in a situation where, post it being released, it's then reviewed, by a regulator and found to not be compliant? What would happen in that situation?
Yeah, so then the regulator would send them a letter. So in Canada, we're not privy to those letters. They're not filed on CDAR like they are in the US, being filed on EDGAR. So they would approach the company, and oftentimes they're forced to retract the non-compliance in a news release. And if you see refiling of technical reports shortly after they've been filed, chances are they've been reviewed and found to have non-compliance in it, and that's the reason why they have refiled. So putting out a news release, retracting information can be a little bit embarrassing. Same with putting out a news release saying that they've had to refile a technical report based on a review by the securities regulators.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a question in the chat here is around a little bit around the length of reports, which I'm sure we've all noticed how long they often can be. So specifically, this question is saying regarding PFS and FS studies, do you find that the 43-101 technical report is now the study report and are too long? Alternatively, do you ever create a separate comprehensive study document for clients that contain kind of all the backup information? So would be more of a summary kind of version. And then, any thoughts on just the length and
Yeah, for sure. So for WOOD, we always encourage our clients anything beyond a preliminary economic assessment, which is a conceptual study. Anything beyond that, a PFS or an FS, we strongly encourage there to be a full separate engineering document because the technical reports and the technical report summaries are summaries. They're summaries of the study. So they are not supposed to have pages upon pages of appendices. Regulators do not like appendices. So that's something, engineering documents, engineering drawings would be appendices to the feasibility studies, the pre-feasibility studies. You don't tend to have that much engineering. Well, you don't have a lot of engineering done at the conceptual stage. So there's no need really to have a separate PEA document to the technical report or technical report summary. Having, 1,000-page technical report filed on CDAR is not ideal. Having appendices could raise the regulators' concerns. More detailed level of study, you should definitely have a more detailed document to accompany that, and not rely on the technical report or technical report summaries as their sole source of information, because they are supposed to be summaries of the study.
Okay, awesome. That's helpful.
Yeah, mining companies tend to want to cut corners and reduce their costs and feel that oh well, we've got a technical report, so that'll act as our feasibility study. And we don't tend to recommend that, but obviously that's the choice of a mining company.
Mhm. Okay, great. Daniel, I'm going to go back over to you because that part of the title of this webinar is maintaining independence. And I think that's an important topic when we talk about these reports as well. So, interested in your perspective, what do we mean when we say maintaining independence? What are some of the challenges associated with that? And maybe just kind of talking us through kind of the realities as well of using for example, if you're working with a junior mining company, kind of using their data to inform the development of the report.
Thank you, Katherine. Basically, in Canada, technical reports and I-43 have to be independent if the company or the QPs have to be independent if the company is not a producing issuer. And what's defined as a producing issuer is a mining company that has at least $90 million of revenue from operations the last 3 years. So the Barricks, the New Eagles, they're producing major producing issuers. They don't have to have their QPs independent, and it can be from the company. And you see that press releases, annual reports. Unless there's something very material, they found this property, it's going to change, then better practice to have someone independent. So making sure they're not pushing their own stuff. For juniors, we say always independent unless they issued a mineral resource estimate and they're updating it and there's not 100% change, then they don't have to have independent. They need QPs. They don't have to be independent. Same thing for reserves. Juniors usually will continue with the same. It's better practice to use someone independent, but if it's not 100% change, they can update their reports without independent QPs. Regarding the data from the clients and how much we can rely on, well, obviously as a geologists don't usually come with their own drills and drill out the property. So they'll use, the drill data assays that come from the juniors or the majors. But everyone's heard or saw the movie Gold or Bre-X, and what happened is the company was talking about how much the deposit, how rich it was. And back then, pre NI 43-101, they took samples, looked at it, had the same pulps or whatever, analyzed, and got the same results. We've learned that way, and now geologists will go on a site, they'll take there's a half core, quarter core, send it either the same lab to see if they have the same, without telling which sample it is, with a tracking number, see if they get the same results for the lab. Best practice would be to send that core to another lab. See, maybe there's a bias at the lab, maybe it's high or low. If it's a major company that has their own labs, that's even more important. I've seen on projects where clients, their own labs underestimated the grade, which is not too bad, but if they overestimated the grade, that's a problem. And also how the sample is done. And now I'm talking with geology. On the process side is another thing. If junior companies sometimes, to move quickly, they'll start doing metallurgical tests. They'll take samples, send that to lab, see how it produces. You need to have the competent person to take the sample properly, not just pick the nice shiny rocks with no waste. Sometimes in certain deposits, the contact between ore and waste, there's deleterious elements. We know mining engineers drill and blast. We will include dilution from the waste. So we're going to bring material. So that sample has to be representative, has to be done properly. So process engineers will not either rely entirely on the labs, even if it's done at external lab. They'll go take a better sample where it's done, where it's taken, not take that for granted. What's the important thing, if you're independent, it's your name that appears in the report. It's not the client's, it's your name. You'll be personally liable if something's wrong. So, people say, can you sign off? Certain clients, juniors say, we did all this work internally, can you just take it and just sign off as a QP? No, you don't. You do your own, as if not necessarily redoing everything, But and we've had clients, that have their own resource model. Their geological engineer, the geologist took over and said, "Look, maybe we'll agree with the way you've modeled it. Maybe we won't." But it's certainly that appears on it, so it has to be independent. But there are things like, G&A, how much overhead costs at the headquarters of the company if it appears in the G&A cost. We're not going to argue that unless we see it's very low. We'll compare to what we've seen before. But it's really the data of the geology and the grades and the mineral processing results. Really, those are the main things that really have to be independent.
Thanks, Daniel. And that can be a tough situation, though, depending on, if there's some disagreement on, for example, the results you get back from the lab or things like that. So
it can be, and sometimes we've had clients we had to say, "Look, we're going to stop this. We're not going to continue because we don't agree. It's our name, and we can't allow our name, ourselves, or even the companies, to be associated with something that we know is wrong." And independent, really, it goes that you're reliable as you have to. I think it goes with the experience. Be able to either peer review or defend yourself in front of your peers.
Yeah.
So what you've done, and you say about taking the data from the client without really looking at it, big question mark, big red flag.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Daniel. It's a good overview. Sally, I've heard that there are potentially some changes coming up from the Canadian regulation standpoint. And interested for you to enlighten us a little bit on what you're able to share. What can we expect? And is there a way for us to be involved in the process at all?
Yeah, so 43101 has functioned very well. I mean, it came out in 2001, it was revised in 2005, and then again in 2011. And it's been ticking along pretty well since then. And as we know, it's internationally recognized, and much to the regulators' dismay, become a bit of a brand. However, it has been so the last review was 2011, 13 years since anything was changed. And there's definitely, the industry's evolved a bit, and sometimes it feels like we're putting a square peg in a round hole. And so in 2022, the regulators actually put out a consultation paper and got a pretty good industry response there. And in it, they highlighted 12 sections, and they asked just questions right across the board, and getting people's opinions and thoughts on these various questions, like, did something need to change or not? And they did this with no promise that they were going to make any changes. However, since then, they have taken on board people's feedback, and also there's been changes to the Crisco template, and as some of you may know online too, that there's been upcoming changes to JORC. SK1300 has come out. Some of these things actually improve upon what's in 43101. So the regulators are going to modernize, I believe is the word they're using, 43101. And the only information I could really give is what's been provided by the BCSC, and they have a great presentation on their website, which they gave in April this year. And so the areas that they're considering either providing additional clarity or guidance, and they'll be working with the Canadian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy with that, because the standards and definitions and best practice guidelines are basically run through the CIM. But they're looking, as I said, to modernize, and there's definitely places in the instrument where we want to align it more with the underlying Crisco template, which means it'll again look more like apples to apples when people look at various reports from the different jurisdictions. They're going to introduce the exploration target, hopefully. That is actually referenced in 43101 now, but it doesn't have a name. So under Crisco, that's been given a name, which is exploration targets. And that's where basically you've got some mineralization, but you haven't drilled it up enough to make it a resource. But you can provide it as a range of tons and grade. So that's going to get a lot more clarity around it. There might be more additional information about data verification. Probably also some more information about how to disclose historical estimates, and in particular when companies want to because right now you can only disclose a resource estimate that's been done by a previous company, and I think they're going to be providing us with some guidance on maybe if the company itself has done a resource and have updated it and they want to disclose a previous one for some reason. I have opinions on that, but I'm not going to go into them. There's also going to be some more additional guidance given around what is a PEA, because right now its definition is just not a PFS or FS, sorry, not a pre-feasibility study or feasibility study. So we're going to get a bit more information about what that means. And maybe also given some additional stuff about qualified persons. Personal site inspection, I don't know what's going to happen, but they're considering right now, the survey that they said indicated people overwhelmingly support having a personal site inspection for very obvious reasons, which I think Daniel mentioned or, alluded to. But there is actually an exception in there where if it's bad weather and the whole property's covered in snow and it's shut down and everything, that maybe you can get a temporary exemption from that. And they're looking at maybe that might be removed. And also just, I think there's going to be some additional information maybe about ESG requirements, maybe beefing them up, maybe not, I don't know. And the reason I'm saying I don't know is because I truly don't know what they're thinking right now, but they're out there now and they're telling people that they are hoping to have this modernization and what they propose to do. They want to have something to go out to the public before PDAC, which is in March 2025. So hopefully by March next year or late February, the regulators will have something out there to the public where every one of us can go in and we can look at what they're proposing to modernize and provide the feedback on it. So keep your eyes peeled for that, everyone.
Thank you. That's great. It's interesting to hear. It's a wide range of potential changes. So I'm sure everyone on the line is going to be keeping an eye on it to see what happens. And then do you have any insight? It sounds like it'll go out to comment kind of in March, but then I imagine it would take probably another year or two for any actual changes to probably take place.
Yeah, based on my experience in 2011, it actually went out the consultation period started long before that. And it actually went out twice for consultation. Okay. Yeah. So it depends on what the feedback is and how much people object to it, whether they actually have to go back and rethink it or not. If it can be fixed, I'm guessing, and I'm hating the fact there might be a regulator on board here, but it's like if the comments come back, it's like it's all reasonable and we just need to tweak this and that. It then goes off to the actual regulators themselves and it takes several months for it to be approved. It'll probably be, I think it would be at the very earliest, and optimistically, by the end of 2025, we'd see those changes and quite possibly into 2026.
Okay. Okay, interesting. And so Maegan, I'm interested in, we often on our WIM panels have young professionals that are first, entering into mining. And so we may have some aspiring QPs on the line. Interested in any advice you might have for them, how can they get up to speed quickly? What type of experience should they be looking to get? And yeah, any advice you can share.
Absolutely. And I think this is really important. When you're coming out of school, whatever it may be that you've taken, I'm going to speak from the standpoint of a mining engineer, but I think the first thing that's the most important is to get out there and get operational experience. I can't stress that enough. I think that that's the most important thing you can do. If you want to be involved on mining projects, you need to have that operational experience. And first step, you need to work towards achieving your PNG or your PGO. And there is all the regulations around the experience levels that you need to even achieve that in the first place. So get that done. That's super important. Seek to work with good mentors. Surround yourself with really experienced people. Make sure you learn from them. They will help your career development. It's super important. Become familiar with the regulations while you're going through your earlier years of your career. Become familiar with the CIM standards, the SME standards. It's also extremely important. Other things you can do, there's lots of courses, there's resources, there's in-person seminars you can take. You can look on the Securities Commission sites, CIM, Roundup, PDAC, lots of different learning opportunities. Absolutely important to go look at many of those, especially as you progress. Lots of the information that will come at you early on might seem daunting, That's why the operational experience really helps, because then when you sit down in these courses after working for several years, it all makes a lot more sense and it's relevant. But yeah, experience, that's the biggest one here. I know that the standard is 5 years. Nikki touched on what that 5 years really entails and when it starts. I would say typically most QPs have a lot more than that, because it has to be subject specific. You have to be an SME in what you're signing off on. And it's really, really important to consider a lot of these things. Daniel and Nikki have touched on several of them, but things can go wrong and you have to be able to defend your work. It's very important that when you outline exactly what you're responsible for on that QP certificate, that you stand behind that work and you can say that you did all the steps you need to defend it. So that's super important. And to be able to do that, you need to have the experience. You have to truly understand the concept. A lot of engineers will come out of school and go work for a major mining company, you know, go through the different rotations, get exposed to doing mine reserves. A lot of those mining companies have very structured procedures on how to go through step by step on how to do a mine reserve. If that's all you've been exposed to, that doesn't mean that you can go work for a junior and fully understand how to set up those procedures for a totally different deposit type or mining method. So there's a lot of things you have to consider, and you have to be educated and experienced to feel comfortable. So my biggest thing is don't rush. Don't rush to be a QP. Spend the time, learn, surround yourself with really, you know, subject matter experts in the areas that you're interested in going with your career. And you'll get to that point where you do feel like you're confident enough, you've established that level of experience required. And at that point, that's when, you know, if you're in a situation where you're working for a consultant or a mining company and you're participating in a technical report, that's when that QP responsibility will come up and you'll have set yourself up for success. So yeah, there's a lot of things involved. Again, don't rush. First, work on experience and getting that PN or PGO, because that's the first steps you need to go through.
Thanks, Maegan. That's great advice. And I think we are nearing the end of the hour. I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question, and I'm going to put it to Daniel, and because it relates back to independence. And this is one of the questions in the chat, and it's around obviously the importance of a qualified person with the clarity and accuracy in reporting their information and their independence within that. So the question is, what key elements should be included or excluded in these reports to safeguard the QP's independence? And how do current regulations ensure that these reports remain impartial or maintain the integrity of the information being presented? Not an easy question to end on, but already
like a legal question.
yeah, there's a lawyer in the crowd for sure.
I don't know where to start. You know, if first of all, if CQP is registered engineer, you know, they've got their professional engineer background, they've got responsibility for that. They can be kicked out of their professional registration, so that, you know, that's important. One thing, kind of related, unrelated, if you're a study manager, and I'm sure Nikki, Maegan, and Sally seen that we rely on QPs provided by the client, apparently independent. You know, they say, yeah, they're QPs, they're independent. Sometimes they're not from a recognized organization, especially if it's, let's say, not in Canada, a Canadian company, but for a deposit, let's say in Africa, and they're using QPs from somewhere else. And it's not, let's say Wood or Ausenco's or Agyei's responsibility for that portion, but if the market authorities review the report and say, oh, that person's actually not a QP, then you have to find a QP. The client has to find a recognized QP and reissue the report. You know, we would not be blamed, but it's kind of, you know, doesn't look good. that a Agyei would or a Ausenco report has to be reissued because there's one QP that is actually a QP. So now what we do is ask the client, is that person right from the start? Is that you have your QPs can be verified, make sure from the start, and not at the end after the press release is out and you've got 35 days. Oh, I've got to find independent QP to sign off because they're not recognized. So that's one thing to make sure we've got the proper people preparing the report. I think I answered part of it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it was a complicated question to get you to answer in the last 2 minutes as well. So, but I want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you so much for the advice you've all given. I think this was a successful battle of the consultants, but I think really just reaffirmed the great experience that we have across the folks on the line. So thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us, and we look forward to hosting another panel like this in the future. Thanks everyone for
Thank you.
joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You'll see. Bye.